Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that I've been doing with racial capitalism and the space privatization topic for LD for January. I think that this is a really interesting topic because I feel like it takes a lot of the interesting components from when debate has been recently debated on college, and also kind of test some other components from when space has showed up on various types of high school activities and resolutions. And I think that there are a lot of really interesting ways that some of the same kind of like arguments and critiques show up. And so a lot of the stuff that I really want to talk about in this video is why racial capitalism kind of fits in as like a key central critique to how people are thinking about the resolution in terms of like what it means to kind of like think about like space flight and human space flight and space exploration as a product of our relationship to particular values of humanism and the way in which we kind of like relate to like how those values kind of like seep into our politics and the way that we think about threats to human life and things like that, and the question of vitality. And in this video I think it's like really important for you to kind of like draw for the rest of the series, whether it be the intro to racial capitalism in space or the kind of like first two videos that I did talking about racial capitalism as a negative strategy versus like policy teams, because I think they're really helpful in getting a lot of the context for what I'll be talking about in these videos. And so I think that it's really important to kind of have like a combination understanding of both in order to get a really good idea of what type of stuff that I'll be covering, because in this video I kind of be talking about how policy teams should be responding to racial capitalism. And so I kind of want to start off by thinking about what are some of the priorities versus that argument, and then thinking about some of the framing and thesis concerns in order for you to kind of like get to the place that you want to be offensively, and make sure that you're kind of like in a place where you're actually answering the critique as nuanced as possible and not really kind of like doing it on the generic basis of how you would just answer critiques generally, because I think that there are definitely more strategic ways and less strategic ways to like figure out how to answer this argument. And so to start off, to kind of figure that out, I just want to talk a little bit about what the priorities are versus racial capitalism. I really think that you want to figure out like what ways that you want to challenge some of the impact calculus that's happening on this page, because I feel like racial capitalism is a critique that is both able to access like a really large scale material impacts, whether it be climate change, whether it be carcerality, etc., but it's also able to kind of like talk about like the frame in which we think about impact calculus, what types of bodies we prioritize, etc. And so I think that the more that you can kind of like emphasize the importance of like the role that space kind of plays in the way that we think about like the continuation of like human life and the possibility for different ways of living and transitioning into a different way of organizing society is incredibly important in this in these types of debates, because I think that teams that only go so far as to justify the question of like why we kind of like protect from like different threats from the question of space in the context of like why that is good for general human value are not really, I think, responding to a lot of the in-depth impact framing about like why that kind of like one-dimensional framing of how we should think about life and death is really bad. And so I feel like you need to make really like nuanced and detailed arguments about the way in which your affirmative is really touching some of the impacts that they're kind of guiding themselves on, and making arguments why your own impacts and like ways in which you're kind of like talking through like the solvency of the affirmative are diversified beyond the question of just like human life generically, and are really able to touch the question of like what is produced for those that don't really experience like the direct benefits of like space travel in itself, who don't see those resources and changes immediately, and what kind of like promises and stuff are kind of like created by the affirmatives kind of like paradigm of like what we should do politically. And I think that that's super important in terms of like how you're gearing your strategy. I feel like when we think about this in the context of how you should be framing your arguments, obviously I feel like you want the judge to just like be able to like weigh the affirmative and be able to do so usually under like what would be kind of like defined as utilitarian calculus. But I feel like honestly that a lot of the debates you really probably won't get to a place where utilitarian calculus by itself is like good if the other team is really contesting you on it. And so I feel like a lot of questions for how you're able to kind of like assert your framing values is just be making arguments about like why the kind of like for whether or not the affirmative is able to win like a historical kind of like archive or a historical kind of like narrative for like how space exploration and space privatization work in the context of like U.S. domestic like history. It doesn't mean that there isn't a reason to kind of like weigh the nuances of the affirmative and be able to justify like why thinking of the affirmative on its own terms, because of the inevitability of space exploration, being able to think about the legal terms that are involved with it and the other forms of like technical precise details is like really important to the ways in which like space policy is really made, making connections between like the types of things that people learn in dialogue spaces for dialogue, and like the ways in which that changes like how kind of like spatial policy is like enacted and demanded. I think is like super important in terms of the connections that you're making about like why the particular debate that you're having is important, and like what it does in order to like move things forward. And I think that it's really important for you to kind of be able to like use that as a place to jump off a lot of the net benefits that you would want to read about like kind of like how you kind of want to like change the terms of like what is the value of the 1AC beyond just like its material basis, and like why epistemologically it's important in order to kind of like address a lot of the impacts that the negative team is going to get towards anyways. And then I think think when you are kind of like moving from this place into like what you should be doing into like your thesis values of the debate, I think a lot of the questions of what you really want to be doing on the thesis is starting to push like all the specific portions of the affirmative that can really answer the question of like, how does the 1AC differentiate itself from the effects of privatization? I feel like because so many of the affirmatives are about rejecting private space exploration in order to create the means for like what it would mean for the public to have more investment or more control over what space exploration looks like. And I think that being able to define a lot of the continuities and differences between like what those things like offer is like super important in order to get people to like get yourself out of like some of the more basic links that'll be done in terms of like why just general like space exploration is bad in the context of like whiteness and humanity and at all. And so I think that when you're kind of like figuring out ways to take your thesis in order to way to get out of those kind of like generic link arguments into when there's a difference between like what happens when private space entities are kind of doing whatever and when like public space entities have to do things for the common good, I think you can make a lot of arguments about like what type of enforcement mechanisms could really allow for a differential way for the public to have access to making decisions in the context of space, which can lead to the creation of like technology and other means that are like good for people commonly, and also can be used in order to address some of the more like nuanced perspectives of like what communities don't normatively get access to, like the benefits of space exploration. And you can make a lot more trickle down arguments in terms of like what your app is accomplishing in that area than I feel like you would be able to just holding yourself hardline to the question of like whether or not the 1AC is able to stop these kind of like outside like neutral threats that are like aren't as high at a percentage level. Because I think that on space you just see so many like impacts that are based in like space debris and stuff like that you don't often see teams that are going head to head on a question of just like what the kind of like benefits of like a public space program that is like necessary because of the inevitability of space transport would kind of do to kind of address the problems of like urbanization and a lot of the other crisis stuff that we've kind of been talking about on earlier on in the other videos that where we kind of discuss the impacts of racial capitalism. And so I think being able to get to that debate as fast as possible is really strategic to kind of set up a lot of the other arguments that you're going to want to end up making on the rest of the line by line. And so making this kind of like thesis level claim really kind of like start to preempt a lot of the arguments you want to make later in terms of the impact calculus is really important also for how you're getting out of the link debates, because I feel like a lot of teams are going to base their link arguments off of the advantages of the affirmative instead of like forcing all of it to be based on the actual action of the plan text, because of the way in which the 1AC kind of like the way in which the resolution kind of operates from a liberal standpoint of rejecting kind of like capitalistic claims over space exploration as a whole. Hopefully this video is helpful, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing with space and racial capitalism and other stuff. And yeah, thanks.